Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to make a dish that takes multiple days to make. I started making it in college and it's from Scandinavia, so when I lived in Sweden I had a chance to eat it as it's more traditionally eaten. I'm referring to Gravlax, which is a sort of marinated or pickled salmon. Now, Gravlax has a very colorful and long history. The dish that we eat today is not a very old dish. It's it does not predate modern refrigeration. The older version was actually a fermented fish product, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next segment. But this is one of sort of the stock dishes of Scandinavia, and it's something that if you learn how to make, you can use it in a wide variety of contexts, and it's really good. So welcome and enjoy. So Gravlax is a dish with a very long history, but the modern dish is fairly recent. Today I'm making the modern version. Another time I might attempt the historical version, but I've never tried that, and so I'm still going to talk about it here. Now, traditionally you get a whole bunch of fish, and if you don't have refrigeration, keeping that fish edible for any period of time is going to be very difficult. So a number of different strategies came about to in order to preserve fish. You see large numbers of these existing side by side in Scandinavia. Lutefisk, for example, where slaked ashwater or lye is used to preserve the fish, is probably the most famous, as are various forms of pickled herring. But another approach exists, which is to salt the fish and to let them ferment. And this is the origin of Gravlax. It's very similar, it's in the same tradition as rockfisk in Norway and surströmming in the sort of Baltic side of Sweden. So the historical dish of Gravlax would be made by taking the fish, packing it with the salt and spices, and then putting it down in a cellar where the cool temperature and salt would control what kinds of bacteria can grow and which kinds cannot. This prevents food poisoning and things like that, and it ensures that you have kind of something edible at the end. Today, fermented fish have largely fallen out of favor. We still eat fermented meat in the form of salami, but not so much with fish. So it's a different dish today. But this is still a dish you can make at home, and so the modern version is done in a refrigerator and is not kept for as long. If you keep it for much longer, it might ferment a bit, but again, that's just making it closer to its historical roots. So here we have the ingredients of the first phase. Obviously, we have our salmon. We have dill. This is a key ingredient here. We have pepper, salt, and sugar. And we'll go ahead and use these ingredients to produce the pickled salmon itself. In the past, I have used dried dill weed instead of fresh. I very strongly recommend using fresh instead. And some people like to toast their peppercorns first. I don't. Later, when this dish is entirely done, I will make a sauce that includes honey mustard and some vinegar and more dill. And then we will serve this with butter, or in this case, something that is used in place of butter in Scandinavia, which is a mixture of butter and rapeseed oil. I don't think I've seen anything exactly the same in the US, so I just use straight butter. And putting it on a nice, heavy, dark bread. Pumpernickel is a good one. Here I just have like a wheat-rye mixture without caraway. So here I have about 300 grams of salmon. So that's about 12 ounces, I think, in the US. And to this, I'm going to add equal parts sugar and salt. I'm going to start with 2 nice spoonfuls. Remember, it should be about twice that. And so again, equal. I'm using a fairly coarse salt here. You can use a finer salt. So you can see I have a fair bit of this. I think that's going to be enough. Then I'm going to grind maybe a decent amount of pepper onto here. And I like to use freshly ground pepper. You can, of course, use pre-ground pepper. So I've ground maybe, I would say teaspoon and a half. If I mix this together here, we will get this mixture of salt, sugar, and pepper. Now I'm going to take a bunch of dill and I'm going to very finely chop it. So obviously I'm going to take this here. Dill is one of the defining ingredients of this dish, and we want to focus on, so if you're limited in the dill, focus on the stems on this piece, but if you have enough, just chop the whole thing. The reason to focus on the stems is because the leaves are much more important in the sauce. So I'm just going to chop this, and I'm going to chop this pretty finely. And then I'll come back when that's all chopped and I can show you. And so now I have this finely chopped dill. I'm going to go ahead and put a fair bit of it in here. And I'm just going to stir this in, see how it is. I expect to put all of it in. Yeah. So this was about 3 stalks of dillweed, of leafy dillweed. Maybe 4. And we have this nice mixture here. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my salmon and I'm going to cut it. Because the way we pack this, actually, we actually don't need to. I think I can do this straight in the pan without packing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a bit of this and I'm going to dab it onto the outside. Actually, this is uneven in size enough. I am going to cut this part off. This will help me pack it more reasonably. So the next step, if I had enough, I would just put it in this loaf pan straight. But I don't have a lot, so I'm actually going to put it in a freezer bag inside the loaf pan. So what we actually do here is we pack this with the salt, and the salt's going to pickle the fish, and it's going to draw out a lot of the moisture. So I'm going to put about half of this in now, and then I'm going to take the big piece and I'm going to put it flesh side down on the salt mixture. Okay, just like that. I'm going to take another good layer, put that layer on top. I'm going to put this on top of that, and then I will put a bit more on top of that, and I think that's going to be enough. Then I'm going to just kind of close this to control like the smell of the salmon, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in the refrigerator. So at this point, we've taken the Gravlax and we've put it in the refrigerator. What's going to happen is that the salt and sugar mixture is going to draw water out of the salmon, and at the same time the salt is going to permeate the salmon and make it so that it's quite a bit more salty than it has been. So keep in mind this is a fairly salty dish and should be eaten appropriately, especially in, you know, don't overdo it and that sort of thing. Now, in the event, as I say, if you were to make this in like a cooler weather cellar, it would actually ferment slowly. The proteins would break down, you'd get a soury, kind of a more sour flavor, and in a case like this where it's heavily salted, that's relatively but not perfectly safe. So, as I say, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and let this brine in the salt. Now, ordinarily, every 12 hours from here, we would just simply take those two fillets out and swap them in their place. But I'm going to do this a little differently this time. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, and if it starts to, you know, in about some time, I will go ahead and add a little bit of weight on top of the salmon. This is very similar to what we would do if we make a sauerkraut, and this first stage is very similar to the salting of the cabbage in sauerkraut. So that's the next stage. And then from there, I will just simply leave it in the refrigerator for about 24-48 hours. And then it will basically be marinating in its own juices at that point. So I have it in this here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set this over here as kind of a spacer, and then I'm going to take some cucumbers and lay them on top. Doesn't have to be perfect, and these are fairly big cucumbers, but basically do this, or maybe replace one of these with this. Now this is going to add some weight, and it's going to help the salmon release its moisture. Note that the top of the bag is elevated so that this shouldn't make any mess. Even if it does, it'll get caught in the pan here, but I don't believe it will. So now it's been 2 days. I had some gentle weight on top of this bag to help kind of press things down and make sure that for most of that time the salmon was under the liquid that came out. So I'm going to pull this out here, and what you're going to see is that some liquids come out. That's expected. And the salt has basically drawn out a bit of liquid from the fish, and the fish has been marinating in its own juices and in the dill. Now this is, if you feel the fish at this point, it's much, much more dense. It's not like the fish it was when we started. And so the next step is to slice this into pieces that we can put on bread. So there are a few different ways we can cut it. For the large peas, the simplest way to cut it is in very, very, very thin pieces like this. just straight vertical. You can see how rigid that is. For the smaller one, you can do the same thing, or you can do slices at an angle. Now keep in mind, this skin might be a little bit tough, so we might have to take it off. I'm just going to try it and see. Yeah, definitely going to take that off. So to remove the fish skin, in this case, because it's tough, would have probably been easier to do before I marinated it, but it's not bad. Just take, because the fish skin is tough, you can basically just run the knife along the fish skin and you're really not going to miss much fish. So I'll come back when I've got this done, and then I'll continue slicing. And actually you don't have to get it all the way off, you just have to separate it, because then we can just continue to slice, and as long as it's separate it will already come off and it'll still hold the fish together. So partly for the reason of the skin, but partly because it just looks so nice, I've decided to cut this larger piece at an angle also. Oftentimes when you get Gravlax at the store, it's cut at these angles. And really, look, I mean, this is visually attractive. And if you taste it, it's fairly salty, a little bit sweet. You taste the dill. I'm going to separate a little more of the skin, then I'll come back and finish. I find this process of cutting the salmon itself very meditative. You want to go for those really nice thin pieces. Otherwise you get a big chunk of salty fish in your mouth, and that's not quite so pleasant. And done well, you get this really kind of nice, very attractive looking, thin, fish. Also, sometimes as you're doing this, you'll feel bones. You can just like pull them out. Right here. If it's hard to do with fingers, you can do with tweezers. And now I'm up to where it's attached again. So I'm going to go ahead and finish filming this part here, and then I will come back to make the sauce. So the sauce is going to be a mixture of dill, honey mustard, white vinegar, and some oil. Now I decided not to get a special oil for this, like just a straight rapsolja, which is kind of what you would typically use in Sweden. What I have instead is just a straight vegetable oil they call a frying oil here, but if you look at the ingredients, it's basically rapsolja with some sunflower oil and some safflower oil and some other things to make it a little more stable at high temperatures. I don't really care about the high temperatures, and the oil combination is fine, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. So again, chopping some of this fresh dill. So I'm going to go ahead and start with 2 spoonfuls of the chopped dill. And to this, I'm going to add 2 spoonfuls of the honey mustard. Now in this case, I have a honey Dijon. You can use other honey mustards, or you can even use a mixture of honey and mustard, which is basically all this is. And to this, I will add about half as much of that of white vinegar. This is 5% acidity, but my spoon is still kind of full of oil, no, of mustard, so I'm going to fill it up twice. Yeah, probably 3 times, because there's not a lot of room there, and the others were pretty heaping. And then some oil. Just a little. So I poured off probably about half the oil I added. So that's closer to 1 part vinegar to 1 part oil. In the past, sometimes I've used as much as 1 part to 2 parts, but for some reason this oil doesn't seem to, I don't really want to overpower it this time, so let's see. Yeah, it's good. So here we have a honey mustard sauce, and if anything that's a little bit sour, you could probably omit the vinegar if you don't want something so sour. And then this would be served kind of on the top as a dressing. Now, I still have some dill here, so if I want to make this all look nice, I will garnish with the dill. And there we have it. Next up, how do we eat this? So basically the way that this would typically be eaten is we take a piece of relatively dark bread. We're going to put this butter, or in this case the mixture of butter and rapeseed oil, which is fairly common in Northern Europe, by the way. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab a couple pieces of this. Now, if you have a piece with the skin, you know the skin's kind of tough, you can just pull the skin off like that. And just put a couple pieces on. Here's another piece. Like that. I'll just do that. You can add a little bit of the sauce on top. And if you want to, you can finish it with a sprig of dill, like that. So that's Gravlax. Now I'm going to go ahead and try some. Here is the piece of Here's a sandwich. You can really taste the salmon, the dill. The sauce adds a little bit of a tang, so don't add too much. The bread, especially a nice like heavy dark bread like this, really comes through with sort of a foundation, and this is really delightful. And so that's Gravlax. Now, I've been making it since college. It's delicious. Served right, it's probably one of the coolest, most interesting flavors of Scandinavia that you'll come across. And in Germany, they do the same thing with pork, and they call it Gravlaxsås, which means Gravlax but done with meat. There are a couple of other sort of important options to keep in mind. You don't have to use the sauce if you don't want to. You can also add a lot more oil slowly to make the sauce a lot thicker. I prefer just a minimal amount of sauce, and so I prefer it stronger and not as thick. But definitely use a really heavy bread with, you know, like some butter or this mixture of butter and oil that we typically see in Northern Europe. Also, this is very much a summer dish. You can't really make it in the winter very well because you don't have fresh dill. I've been making it since college. It's a wonderful summer flavor of Scandinavia. And although today, of course, it's something you can buy year-round, but it's very different when you make it yourself. The flavor is different, the texture is different. I've never seen something with the sort of the firm texture you get from homemade Gravlax. Never found that in the store. You know, it's just a delicious dish all around. In Germany, they actually do the same thing with pork, and they call it Gravlaxsås, which means basically same thing, but pork. And again, historically, it's something you do in the summer. In your cellar, you'd let it ferment and you could eat it later. But today we would do it in the refrigerator and we would just eat it relatively soon. So one thing people sometimes do with the sauce is they add a lot more oil and they slowly beat it up, and you'll get something much thicker. I don't like to do that because I like a stronger flavor to the sauce, and I just simply put less sauce on. But if you don't like the sauce, you don't even have to use the sauce. The sauce is very optional. And in fact, in Scandinavia, I found a lot of people really like Gravlax, but just not with the sauce. So that's the basic point. It's very easy to make. It doesn't take a huge amount of labor or effort. It just takes some patience. So knock yourself out, enjoy it, and if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me in the comments or otherwise, and hope you really enjoy this.